Hello, everybody. Today it's me, Eric Bergman, the founder of Great.com, who is doing this interview. And we're meeting with GFI, Good Food Institute, and Bruce Friedrich. Friedrich. We've been just having a conversation about his German ancestors, or at least the name where it comes from. Welcome, Bruce.
I'm so glad to be here, Eric. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining. And the reason why I'm doing this episode is the same as when I've done episodes in the past. It's something that sparks my curiosity more than anything. And it's an organization that have proven to be highly effective and recommended by Founders Pledge and Open Philanthropy Project, and probably others I don't know about, for doing extraordinary work with minimal financial not minimal, but with the least amount of money spent. And that sparks my curiosity. That's what I want to support the most. And I've actually been donating to GFI myself several times and will continue doing so without actually knowing that much about them, to be honest, just by trusting the recommendations. So I'm here to a large extent because I want to settle my curiosity or fill my curiosity. What's the way you're saying it in English? I'm trying to I'm translating a Swedish expression and realize it doesn't really work.
Satisfy my curiosity, maybe?
Satisfy my curiosity. Yeah, we can go. That's what I'm going for. So welcome, Bruce. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Eric. Thank you so much. I'm super honored to be here and grateful to you for your support. Excited to have a conversation about what GFI is and what we do and why we agree with you that the marginal value of what we're working on is very, very high. So thanks so much.
Thank you for being here. So tell me, Bruce, what is GFI? What is it that you guys are doing?
So GFI is essentially a science think tank. We have about 200 full-time employees around the world. GFI is actually 6 different organizations. So there's GFI US, and then GFI India, Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific, based out of Singapore, and Europe. We operate in Brussels and London. And then also a little bit in Germany as well, and looking at expanding into additional European countries. The plurality of GFI's team members are scientists, and the focus is basically on looking at industrial animal agriculture and applying the principles that have worked and are working in renewable energy and electric vehicles to the external costs of industrial animal agriculture. So if what you want to do is address the harms of fossil fuels, there are many, many great things people can be doing. So working on more energy efficient buildings, more energy efficient light bulbs, encouraging people to consume less energy, all of that is great. But at the end of the day, the world is going to consume more energy through 2050. And the biggest value and absolutely essential is that we figure out how to shift to renewables. With transportation, again, it's great to have walkable cities. It's great to have better public transport. It's great to encourage people to ride bikes and walk. But at the end of the day, we need electric vehicles because through 2050, there will be more cars sold. There will be more miles driven. Same thing here. Industrial meat production and consumption just continues to go up year after year after year after year. Through 2050, it's expected to be somewhere on the order of 60% more to 3 times as much industrial animal meat. We should be educating people. We should be decreasing the carbon intensity. We should be having all of the above strategy. But we absolutely need to figure out how we make meat from plants, how we cultivate actual animal meat directly from cells. It will be a huge part of mitigating the climate emissions, eliminates the methane, as well as a lot of other significant benefits. And we think actually that shifting from industrial animal meat that requires animals to creating the exact same meat experience from plants, and the exact same meat experience just completely. It's actually the exact same animal meat with cultivated meat. We think that's probably significantly easier than what's going to be required for the total clean energy transition. So the transition away from fossil fuels into 100% electric vehicles is probably quite a bit harder than a transition to plant-based meat and cultivated meat. So GFI is basically, if you think about an organization like Environmental Defense or some environmental organization that's working on renewable energy and electric vehicles, policy and science, that's what GFI is doing. So we're working on the science predominantly, but in order to have the biggest possible impact, so we are a science think tank, and our number one goal, our global battle cry, is to convince governments to recognize that they will not meet their Paris climate agreements unless alternative proteins are successful. And there are a bunch of other benefits in terms of antimicrobial resistance, in terms of pandemic risk, in terms of food security, in terms of food safety. So convince governments to put billions of dollars into this transition in the same way that they had put billions of dollars into renewable energy and electric vehicles. And that's our global battle cry. So it's sort of, there's a significant policy focus, there's a significant science focus, and then sort of the third programmatic pillar is industry, working with everything from startups and investors to the biggest food and meat companies in the world to help them see this as an opportunity, something they should participate in rather than as a threat, something they should be, afraid of or work against.
That's amazing. Let's see if I can summarize that a little bit, and you can correct me if I misunderstood anything. So basically, GFI is a think tank of 200-ish people, mainly scientists, covering a big part of the world, working to get the governments and people in general to understand that to reach our climate goals, we have to make drastic changes in the world of meat, and mainly moving from the animal-based meat to alternatives, either plant-based or growing from cells themselves, which could be identical to the meat it is. That would then need to be better than the regular meat or the previous meat in, well, first and foremost for climate in this case, but I'm assuming also in price and taste, ideally, because you will be able to create all kinds of things with this, which isn't already meat. And you're working to get this happen by convincing governments to invest billions of dollars into this in a similar way as they already do with renewable energy in general, but probably by subsidizing the transport industry and so on and so forth. And I really liked what you said about that you believe it's easier to get the world, create the meat that is, well, the meat alternative that is actually plant-based or created in a petri dish, that it is to do the same thing for the transportation industry or inventing these cars and doing all that. I think that it resonates a lot with me, that would be easier. Yeah, so did I cover what you said? Did I understand it correctly?
Yeah, you did. And just to underline one thing you said, I mean, just like the goal of renewable energy, like when people come into a room and they flip the light switch, they want the lights to come on. That's the thing they want. Yeah. When people get into a car, it's a little bit more nuanced, but there are certain things people want when they get into a car and they start driving. People are generally not going to pay more for the lights to come on and it's renewables. There are early adopters who will, but most people won't. People are generally not going to sacrifice a whole lot on behalf of electric vehicles. So the challenge really is to satisfy the things that people care the most about. Yeah. Table stakes on food is price and taste. Only early adopters are going to pay more. And really almost nobody is going to sacrifice on taste. So the first goal, and basically the scientific challenge, and I sometimes talk about every single person at GFI has one goal, and that goal is plant-based and cultivated meat that tastes the same or better, and that costs the same or less. We want to basically win in the marketplace. And because it is so much more efficient to turn plants into meat or to cultivate actual animal meat, and basically it'll look like a brewery. So all food starts in a food lab, not all food, but meat does. Starts in a food lab, but it's you graduate out of the petri dish pretty quick, and it ends up looking essentially like a brewery. And the thing that makes it so amazing for climate, land use, and biodiversity also will make it amazing for profitability. So right now, it takes the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is the chicken. It takes 9 calories of feed into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. It takes 40 calories of feed into a cow to get 1 calorie back out. That's World Resources Institute number crunching from their scientists. So probably everybody listening to this agrees with the vast majority of people that food waste is a problem. Right now, we waste about 40% of all food that is produced globally is wasted. This is literally 800% food waste just in the physiology of the chicken. Like, you're not actually throwing away all of the crops that were fed to the chicken, but if it takes 9 calories into a chicken in the form of wheat, soy, oats, or whatever, if it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out, you're not personally throwing that food away, but that food is essentially wasted. Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the food to the chicken or the cow or the pig. You grow all of those crops and you ship those crops to a feed mill and you operate the feed mill and you ship the feed to the farm and you operate the farm and you ship the animals to the slaughterhouse and you operate the slaughterhouse. It's like multiple extra stages of production, multiple extra energy intensive and polluting factories. And once you crunch all of these numbers, what you find is that relative to beef, for example, plant-based meat causes 1/20th of the direct emissions, 0 methane, and requires 1/20th of the land. Even compared to chicken, which is the most efficient of the meats, plant-based meat requires 1/6 the land and causes significantly less climate emissions. Doesn't require antimicrobials, doesn't contribute to pandemic risk, and also is really a boon from the perspective of food security and global poverty because it requires so many fewer resources.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So wrapping it up a little bit, it's like financially, this, given the enough investment at this early stage, financially, this should be a no-brainer decision because it should be so profitable to do it without actually having animals. You either plant-based beef or cultivated is that the petri dish kind of solution, which obviously isn't in a petri dish. I realize that, but like when the meat grows of itself.
Yeah, just like you can take a cutting from a plant, and you can grow that into an entire plant. You give it water, give it sunlight, give it nutrients. Same thing here. You can take just not that many cells, a sesame seed biopsy, and literally grow a sesame seed biopsy into enough animal meat to feed billions of people. Basically, the idea is, just imagine a cutting from a plant becoming massive amounts of plants. So it's the same sort of thing. And the thing about it is it doesn't require antimicrobials. About 70% of medically relevant antimicrobials right now are fed to farm
animals. What is animal microbials? What's that?
So it's the antibiotics.
Antibiotics. Okay, so animal antibiotics. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So about 70% of medically relevant antibiotics right now are fed to farm animals, which is driving antibiotic resistance. I mean, Eric, if you want to scare, when we get done, Google the end of working antibiotics.
I've done that. That's scary.
The UK government says it's a more certain risk to humanity than climate change. And the fact that we are drugging farm animals, 70% of all medically relevant antibiotics fed to farm animals, is driving antibiotic resistance, could spell the end of working antibiotics globally, which would be a human health catastrophe. The former head of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, she said the end of working antibiotics is the end of modern medicine. So plant-based meat, cultivated meat, do not require antibiotics at all. So a full shift to alternative proteins, which would include things like smallholder farms also not using antibiotics, regenerative ranching, also not using antibiotics. Smallholder subsistence fishing communities, also not using antibiotics. Like, this is better for those folks because the pressure on smallholders, the pressure on pastoralists, the pressure on subsistence fishing communities is this massive agricultural consolidation and expansion. By getting rid of that and shifting to plant-based meat and cultivated meat, we can eliminate antibiotics completely from food production, which would have massive positive ramifications for human health as well.
Yeah, I haven't even thought of that. When I think of like the importance of changing the food industry in terms of meat, I think personally mainly of ending all the animal suffering. That's like my main concern. Obviously climate change is a big one, but there is something just that speaks to me about this horrific scenarios of the meat industry that is just undescribable, and that I don't even dare to think of because it's so freaking horrible. And then just climate is another big reason, and then antibiotics is a huge one, which I personally haven't even considered myself, but it makes a lot of sense in the full-on equation as well. Let's go back to cultivated meat a little bit, because this is something that sparked my curiosity. Like, does this exist in any like commercial way right now, or where is this research?
Well, there are about 150 cultivated meat companies. There is
in the US or in the world, or
in the world.
Yeah.
They're all insanely small. So the first cultivated meat company started at the end of 2015, and they just a month or two ago got approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So in the U.S., you need for land animal meat, you need approval from both of those agencies. Two companies got approval from both of those agencies maybe a month or 6 weeks ago. So there's one, Jose Andres is a famous chef over here, and one of his restaurants in DC is serving cultivated meat once a week. And then there's a woman, Dominic Kren, who has a restaurant in San Francisco. And one of her restaurants is serving cultivated meat once a week in San Francisco. So those two restaurants, as well as a small handful in Singapore, are the only places you can currently buy cultivated meat. There are restaurants, it is being sold, not being sold, it is being consumed in a lot of other places. The Netherlands has officially approved demonstration consumption. Multiple companies in Israel are regularly doing demos. Netanyahu has eaten cultivated meat probably half a dozen times in Israel. He's a big booster. I think he's the one head of government who's had cultivated meat, and he's had it repeatedly. Although John Kerry, when he was in Israel, John Kerry is the climate ambassador in the U.S., former Secretary of State, has also had cultivated meat when he was in Israel. And New York City's mayor was there last week, and he had cultivated meat. So it's not non-existent. Sorry for the double negative, but it's going to be a little while before anybody can get it in a grocery store or a restaurant.
What kind of investments are going into this space right now?
It's so far vanishingly small, Eric. So I mentioned that there have been about 150 companies, that there are about 150 companies. All of them have been formed since, I think there was one at the end of 2015, 8 at the end of 2016. Across all of them, they have raised just shy of $3 billion US. And just to level set on that, that is less than the price of one gigafactory for lithium-ion batteries. It's less than the price of one electric vehicle battery factory. So not very much. And the fact that they have products and are actually selling in 2 countries and being consumed in additional countries on what is essentially a rounding error, if you're talking about something like renewable energy transition or EV transition, I think should give us a lot of hope for what can happen once this starts to be properly resourced. And I do just want to underline something that you sort of nodded at earlier. Paris climate goals are literally impossible unless meat consumption goes down. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that explicitly. There are many, many peer-reviewed scientific articles about the fact that even if we stay where we are now, 350 million metric tons globally of land animal meat, even if we stay where we are now, climate goals will be impossible. Every single prediction, 11 peer-reviewed predictions, the lowest is 62% more meat by 2050. And something I've started to say to people in the climate community is, what else do you think might solve the problem? Like, what are you enthusiastic about that might actually cause meat consumption to go down? And even the people who their entire lives are dedicated to food system climate change reduction, this and convince people to eat less meat are the only two things that are even being tried. The only two things that are being tried are education, tell people to eat less, figure out how to do that, and make the meat in a way that eliminates the methane and slashes climate and slashes land use needs. And I'll just say I'm enthusiastic about educating people. I think we should continue to tell people about the problem and encourage people to make personal change. But even in the United States, where education's been going on for more than 50 years, the 5 highest years for per capita meat consumption are the most recent 5. Per capita meat consumption, 5 highest years, the last 5 years. Globally, it just keeps going up. Very enthusiastic about an all of the above strategy. But the reality is climate change goals, Paris climate change goals, are impossible unless alternative proteins succeed. The climate policy community really needs to put this on their agenda as the third pillar alongside renewable energy and electrification of transport. And it's a much bigger payback than electrification of transport. And as we talked about earlier, the science challenges here are probably, and the scaling challenges here are probably quite a bit easier than the science and scaling challenges of a global transition to renewables and EVs.
So tying this back to GFI, cultivated meat, for example. So one of the main things that GFI does is working to get this knowledge out there and getting governments and companies to kind of understand and take strategic decisions in this way. And you're doing that by influencing experts and meeting with politicians and company leaders. That's one of the main things that you're doing. Am I getting that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, our number one goal is to build the scientific ecosystem globally, get as many tissue engineers, plant biologists, biotechnology scientists, et cetera, as possible, focused on solving both the product production, so products that compete on price and taste, and then the scale-up challenges. The number one way we do that is by convincing policymakers that they should make this a national strategic priority. And then the complement to that, as you nodded at, is helping the really big food and meat companies to recognize what an incredible opportunity this is for them. The companies see themselves as protein production companies. They're not wedded to this 12,000-year-old technology. If there's a way that they can make more money making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells, that's pretty appealing. So just consistently saying to the really big meat and food companies, hey, you should be a part of this, in addition to educating and helping startups and investors understand the opportunity as well. So our target audiences really are scientists, policymakers, and sort of the private sector in the food industry, from the smallest to the biggest.
How does that happen? How do you meet with these policymakers? What is a conversation? What's a normal day-to-day thing that you're going through then?
So on the science side, basically anybody who is a tissue engineer, anybody who's working in biotechnology or biosciences more broadly, Anybody who is a scientist working on biomanufacturing in particular, but really anything in the electrical engineering and anything that would be involved in infrastructure. Sort of the pride and joy of the organization is our Alt Protein project. So we have 15 university chapters. It's called the Alt Protein Project. They're all over the world. And this is a rigorous program. So GFI as an organization, one of the things that Founders Pledge and Open Philanthropy really like about GFI is that we are super data driven. And we're not just asking what is an awesome thing to do. We're asking what is the next most important thing that we can possibly do to advance our mission? What is the greatest marginal impact of the next thing that we decide to do? And we measure those things. So we use the OKR system that Google popularized as our KPI system. We have 5 objectives, and then we have key results, which are basically our SMART goals. And we require that all of our Alt Protein projects, it's a very rigorous application process for all of these college chapters. Every college chapter has to have 2 founders. They have to sign an MOU with us. They have to go to training. They have to check in throughout the year at set times. And they have to set their own OKRs. And those OKRs are basically focused on making sure that every tissue engineer at every one of these campuses, every biotechnology scientist at every one of these campuses, every mechanical engineer at every one of these campuses understands that essentially they can save the world through science by doing this work vocationally. And helping us to change this 12,000-year-old way of making meat into this new and much better way of making meat. So that's how we reach out to scientists. And then the goal of that is to get all of those, the best scientists in the world, going to their governments. And then we also do this, but we want them basically to go to the governments and say, hey, we need funding for this research, and here's the payback to the government. Then on the other side, we do have policy teams. Sometimes the word lobbying can have specific definitions and not be in the way that it's like influence the government via lobbying, can be different in different areas of the world. But when I'm saying lobbying, what I mean is have conversations with government officials to help them to recognize that if they care about things like antimicrobial resistance, pandemic risk, climate change, land use, food security, alternative proteins are going to be critically important to those goals. But even more importantly, insanely lucrative. So like in the United States, when we're having conversations with Republicans, this is a bipartisan issue. And when we're having conversations with Republicans, as a party, they're not all that keen on like climate change as an issue that they want to address. But they are super keen on economic competitiveness. They're super keen on manufacturing jobs in the heartland. They're super keen on the United States being a top country for innovation. So there have been a couple of McKinsey-led economic analyses focused on alternative proteins, and they found that by 2050, the alternative protein industry globally will be worth between $700 billion and $1.1 trillion, and will create 83 million jobs. So that is a conversation we have with everybody in the policy community. And we oftentimes point out, look, China has something like 100 gigafactories for lithium-ion batteries. Whether you like electric vehicles or not, if you are a legislator in the United States, the fact that we have 4 and China has north of 100, you would rather have those jobs in the United States. And hey, in the 90s, the US was the one that did the technological advancement. And now the actual batteries are being manufactured in China. Similarly with solar panels, the United States in the 90s, it was US scientists who made the really big advances in solar. Now we're producing 1% of our solar panels. China's producing 60, Asia's producing 80% of our solar panels. And so basically saying, look, this is a $1.1 trillion global game. This is 83 million jobs. Do you want those jobs in that economic activity somewhere else, or do you want it here? Let's build those manufacturing facilities here. And that is a language that across the partisan divide, everybody cares about. The Biden administration had its American Jobs Plan. And one thing was jobs, one thing was economic activity, and then one thing was climate. So climate is integral to selling. I'm sorry, jobs and economic activity are integral to selling something like the big climate bill that the Biden administration passed. This is basically the same, but arguably, let's get in now, rather than like let's try to claw our way back in 20 years later. China's not going to close their lithium-ion, gigafactories. They're not going to stop manufacturing solar panels. So we're really running from like way behind. On plant-based meat and cultivated meat, that is an industry that is just barely getting going. The governments that incentivize these industries, the governments that take this seriously, massive external costs that they can mitigate, and also just huge economic opportunity. So that's the conversation that we have with policymakers. And then not dissimilar with the really big corporations. It's actually been easier than I would have expected with the corporations, but basically with the really big food and meat companies, all of whom are taking both plant-based meat and cultivated meat seriously, all of whom we see as allies. The pitch is basically, digital, let's flash back. This is an analogy. Digital film technology is just beginning. Do you want to be Kodak and resist, or do you want to be Canon and lean in? Kodak went bankrupt. Canon is the biggest film company in the world. That's where we are with meat. So, hey, meat company, lean in. And so far they are, which we're finding super gratifying.
Tell me about that. In what way does it show that they are leaning into this? Can you give an example of something that's happening?
Yeah, I could give a lot of examples, Eric. I'm a talker.
Yeah, you are, and I enjoy it. So please tell me. The downside is there's so many different things to pop out that I want to ask about, and then you stop by saying that sparks the curiosity right now. So I'm asking about that one. Tell me about one of those examples, because I don't know any of them. I know. Short side story, something that has interested me lately is getting the shipping industry from diesel engines to ammonia engines. And I know that technology is fairly simple, would make a huge climate impact, and fairly recently Maersk, this huge shipping companies, is doing a lot of research to actually get there, which inspires me a lot. And it's something that I've donated to previously with political lobbyism and stuff around that. So I don't have such an example in the meat industry. So a similar example would make me happy.
Well, I got a bunch, but I'll start with JBS, which is the largest meat company in the world, bigger than Tyson, bigger than Cargill. They're Brazilian. And JBS is going all in on plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And they are looking to GFI Brazil, as their implementation partner on both these things. So JBS has a plant-based meat line, and JBS has invested $100 million in basically buying their own cultivated meat company and starting a factory. So $40 million in the company, $60 million to build the pilot facility. The second and third largest meat companies in the world are both American. One's Tyson Foods, the other is Cargill. They have each invested in two different cultivated meat companies. Tyson is also investing in plant-based meat companies, and Cargill, because it goes beyond just meat, is doing its own plant-based meat. So they've got essentially white label plant-based meat, and their CEO, Tyson's. The heir apparent to Tyson, their CFO, John Randall Tyson, so the son of the board chair and currently, CFO, so in the top upper echelon of the company, last year he said Tyson sees alternative proteins as the next frontier in meat. And they've been proving that by investing in multiple cultivated meat companies, two of the most successful, and investing in their own plant-based meat line. The Tyson plant-based nuggets, I have to say, are really quite good, and they have a variety of them. So second biggest meat company in the world, and there you go into the grocery store, and there is their animal-based meat, and there is their plant-based meat. Exact same thing with JBS, and kind of even more so with Cargill. So those are the three biggest meat companies in the world. And sometimes people will say, well, they haven't stopped doing animal-based meat. I mean, they are for-profit companies. Their CEO would be removed. if they stopped doing the things that were most profitable. But can you imagine a world where the fossil fuel companies didn't fight clean energy transition? Can you imagine a world where GM launched the EV1 back in 1996, the first electric vehicle, and there's an amazing documentary called "Who Killed the Electric Car," about just like what a farce it was, and they ended up pulling them all back and crushing them. Can you imagine a world where the car companies enthusiastically in the 80s started transitioning to EVs? Those are the cards we're being dealt on plant-based meat and cultivated meat, and we think really seize it.
That makes me really happy. I had no idea about that. To me, my expectation was that the meat industry was fighting this rather than supporting this, and like would fight the use of the word meat, for example, that you wouldn't be allowed to use it unless it actually came from a real animal. That was my expectation. So this sounds like it's the complete opposite of that.
Yeah, there's an unfortunate narrative that some people, especially I think in the vegan community, are attempting to create that is exactly what you just described. So I had a conversation with a journalist where she wanted to write an article that basically said that, and I explained to her that it wasn't true. That the state legislation to ban meat terminology in the United States, I think we have two state legislatures that are all year. I think it's New York and California maybe have a legislature that's similar to the federal legislature. A whole bunch of them meet like for 2 months every 2 years. And there are state legislatures. If you are a rancher, so all of these people have other jobs. A lot of them are ranchers. A lot of them have dairy farms or whatever. So there have been some state legislators that have successfully passed legislation to ban meat labels. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But nobody in the mainstream food industry, as far as we can tell, has lifted a finger to try to support those things. So you look at the really powerful lobby groups in Washington, the National Pork Producers Council, the American Meat Institute, the National Chicken Council, all of the like really powerful lobby interests. And you look at, they have to do lobby disclosure forms. So what did they work on? They're not working on this. This is not in their top 100 priorities. And that's because they're actually supportive. They don't care if plant-based meat is called meat. They don't care if plant-based milk is called milk. So there is the effort that you describe, but it's generally some small cattle rancher in Montana who, because it's really easy to pass legislation in Montana or Missouri or Alabama, they can pass legislation. And then in the eyes of the media, which is looking for, they want to create this, even if it doesn't exist. And then vegans really, they want to feel victimized. So they want to create that too. And it's unfortunate. So you can find stories claiming that that's happening. It's not our impression that that's happening. GFI is having a conference in a little bit less than a month. We have ADM, which I think is the largest food company in the world, is sponsoring the conference. All of the major meat companies are going to be there. Multiple additional, Cargill, second biggest meat company in the US, CP Foods, biggest meat company in Asia, sixth biggest meat company in the world, is sponsoring the conference. So the meat industry, so it'd be a little bit like if like auto workers unions were opposing EVs, which in fact they are, or something like that. So there are some dairy farmers, there are some cattle ranchers, but the meat industry writ large and the more powerful interests, they see this as an opportunity.
That's really promising. And the reason for that is then probably like the financial incentives, then I'm assuming like the big companies see that this is something that can make us a shit ton of money.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely the shit ton of money variable for sure. And there's also, I mean, it's just also a hassle for them to have to do. I mean, it really is an antiquated technology. The idea of growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals, it's an antiquated technology. It's constant headaches for them. They don't, I'm not sure that it's like crushing their bottom line. to have a steady stream of articles about the climate and land use needs of the current system. But it's got to be like somewhat demoralizing for some of the people who work there. So I wouldn't, I mean, yes, it's definitely, if you can go from something that requires 9 to 40 inputs to something that requires 1 to 3 inputs, the profit opportunity there is obviously colossal. But I wouldn't write off the human element. Like everybody is the hero of their own narrative. So when somebody, goes home at night, and they're having dinner, and their spouse is there, and their, son or daughter is there, and the front page of the local newspaper has something about, deforestation, and their dad or mom works for the company that's integrally involved in that deforestation, like that's got to be pretty uncomfortable. And like, what am I doing with my life? The sort of existential angst amplified. So I don't want to be, all, sort of prima donna about this. I think it is mostly profitability. But I also think pretty much everybody wants to be a good person. So if you can make even more money doing something that doesn't come with all those external costs and harms, that's pretty appealing.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Like it makes, like it sounds like a no-brainer solution when you think of it. Like it makes the production so much easier. You can have everything more or less in one facility rather than all of these different companies doing a lot of different things. And you have the moral aspect of it, which, I mean, my assumption is that basically nobody wants to work in an animal farm, and seeing that amount of misery every day, even like, I assume that you get numbed out very quickly, but still I don't think anyone, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be in an animal farm where they are like kept in cages and have 1 square meter to move around at best for the rest of their lives. Like I totally see like the HR benefits of moving away from it, and like, yeah, all of the other aspects as well. It's interesting to think of how many positives there is to moving from this. So I'm coming back to, you mentioned that there are 150 companies that have been started in the last 7 years, and there was only a few in the beginning. And you mentioned there were 3 billion that have been going into this right now, and the way I heard it was that it was mainly private equity money going into it so far. How is this changing? I'm assuming it's like a rapidly increasing trend.
I mean, the whole global economy, including the investor side of the global economy, as you're surely watching, startups are failing left and right across every sector. That's happening here as well. One thing that we haven't talked, and just investment capital is drying up to a significant degree. One of the things that we haven't talked about is that this isn't self-actualizing. It's not easy. I think a lot of people expected precise biomimicry using plants to be easier than it has turned out to be. I think people probably mispredicted what it's going to look like to scale this up. So on the one hand, there's the, you are aware of the Valley of Death problem as well as anyone, Eric. But the basic idea of the Valley of Death for listeners who aren't is you have the funding on the front end to solve the science challenge. And then there's a series, there's a place where you need to scale up production of the science challenge. And the idea is that for every doubling of supply, price will fall by a certain percentage, and that's going to vary based on the industry. It's called Wright's Law. We are somewhere in the science funding trajectory, although we have not yet nailed plant-based meat biomimicry. I would argue that we put basically nothing into it, certainly relative to solving the problems of electric vehicles, the problems of renewable energy, even the problems of space exploration. Like, the scientific challenges are significantly less than things we have already solved across a whole bunch of other industries. But the funding has been basically non-existent, and it just started. The idea of biomimicking meat from plants is something like a decade old. The idea of cultivating meat from cells and moving this into something that actually looks like an industry is well less than a decade old. So we're still somewhere in the science trajectory, really, for plant-based meat and cultivated meat. The current method of producing cultivated meat is way south of optimized. We need much bigger bioreactors. We need much less expensive cell culture media. But the real challenge is going to be what the valley of death that has hit so many other industries. You're going to need to be producing factories for production at the $200 million level up to $500-600 million. And a startup can't get that money from venture capital. It's going to need a bank loan, but most of these startups are not great risks for banks, especially if they have this new technology. So what has worked for renewable energy and electric vehicles is government guaranteed long-term low interest payback loans. Tesla is one of the most valuable companies in the world. Elon Musk talks about how it would have failed at least twice if not for government loans. And multiple other times, if not for the fact that he had his own billions of dollars to just sink in and say, I'm going to do this. Maybe we have a 90% chance of failure. I'm going to put my own billions of dollars into this. And the DOE in the United States took a bet on Tesla at least twice that he said they would have otherwise failed. So this is not easy. The scale up and, especially price parity is not easy. And that's why we need significantly more government investment. But the payback for the governments that invest, like governments will invest, we're tacking in the right direction. And the paybacks in terms of economic growth, the paybacks in terms of jobs will be huge. But that is going to have to happen. So in response to your question, less money has been going in to this as into all startups over the last couple of years. But a lot more, not nearly enough, but a lot more government money has been going in. And we are only just starting to see the global climate community come to the realization. Like, I was chatting with somebody who works on methane, and she was saying, we used to call agriculture, we used to think agriculture was not solvable. This is what Bill Gates said too when he launched his How to Avert a Climate Disaster a couple of years ago. They just basically thought agriculture was too diffuse. We tried to convince people to eat less meat. It didn't work. It's not going to work. We don't have a way to solve this problem. So let's focus on clean energy transition. That's hard enough. It warrants all our resources. The global climate community is beginning to wake up to the importance of this. We expect the global health community will wake up to it too. And assuming that continues to happen, just super bullish on the opportunities here. But the private sector is going to need some public sector support on this industry, just as it has on, I think, probably every single industry that has involved manufacturing that needed to scale up.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I think it's time for us to wrap this up a little bit, but you've made me a lot more bullish and optimistic with this, and that was a big win for me because I'm in a better mood than I was when I started this conversation, and have higher hopes of humanity, climate, and cultivated meat, which I knew very little about.
Can I make two other points, Eric?
Feel free, go ahead.
The first one is pandemic risk. This is, before we got on, we were talking about just sort of human nature, and how odd human nature is. It is really quite remarkable that we just sunk trillions of dollars into dealing with COVID, and yet we put almost nothing into pandemic risk prevention. And this is something that we're really spending some time trying to figure out how to deal with, because the International Livestock Research Institute, International Livestock Research Institute, worked with the United Nations Environment Program. They released a report called Preventing the Next Pandemic. They convened 13 of the world's leading zoonotic disease specialists, and their consensus list of the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic, number 1 on the list was increased meat consumption. So, now we're at 350 million metric tons. In 2050, we're going to be at 6 to 900 million metric tons. Each animal is a potential vector for the next COVID 2024, COVID 2027, or whatever. Their number one on a list of 7 is increased meat production. Their number 2 is industrial animal farming, because we're breeding these animals that are so genetically similar that their immune systems don't fight off disease. So disease can spread in a way with genetically similar animals that it doesn't spread if you have a more varied stock of animals. And we're keeping them in the conditions that you were describing earlier, which are also disease breeding factories. Of the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic, the only one not linked to industrial animal farming is wet markets. Kind of ironic. The one that's not linked actually has to do with eating animals. But the top 2 literally go away if we transition to plant-based meat and cultivated meat. So this as a pandemic risk prevention measure goes from 2 of the 7 most likely causes just completely eliminated, which I think is pretty remarkable. And another reason that I'm bullish on the idea of governments taking this seriously, if we can break past the sort of human nature, we don't plan sort of weird kink in human beings. And then the other thing to say is this is a global South issue. So you look at something like climate change, it's obviously tautological, basically, that the people who did the least to contribute to climate change are the people most adversely impacted by climate change. But the fact that we are right now feeding 1.25 billion metric tons of corn, wheat, and soy to farm animals, that's up about 40% from a decade ago. If we just continue to require so much land and so much feed to feed to farm animals, prices of crops and land are going to continue to go up. That leads to starvation. That throws smallholders, pastoralists off their land, subsistence fishing communities off their communities. So all of the issues we're talking about most adversely impact the global majority, people in the global South. So this really is a social justice issue as well. It's super tractable. And yeah, the main last 2 points I wanted to make was pandemic risk and the global South. So thank you for humoring / indulging
pretty
me.
Good points, I would say. If we can, if we could avoid pandemics and we could solve, starvation, I'd say that it's good points to make. What can someone do who wants to support you, Bruce?
It's going to be really varied, I think, on the basis of what the person is doing. But a few things that we absolutely need. Sometimes I'll go to effective altruism conferences, and somebody, I chatted with somebody who's a professor at a medical school, and she's a tissue engineer, and she wanted to go full time into alternative proteins. Or I chatted with another woman who was a PhD candidate, and she was looking at zoonosis, and she wanted to go full time into animal proteins. So I'll say, yes, GFI is hiring. Yes, all of these companies are hiring. But if you are already an expert in global development or some aspect of global health or environmentalism or biodiversity or any of these issues, stay where you are and elevate alternative proteins as a solution. Write about it, talk about it, and contact us because we'd love to work with you on that. So there's literally not, as far as I'm aware, one piece of peer review literature that's been written so far that identifies most of what we talked about just now, Eric. So we need thought leaders across all these issues. So that's number one. If somebody is young and they're thinking about what to do in college, save the world through science. Look at the scientific needs here, and go into tissue engineering, mechanical engineering, anything that would help you make meat from plants and cultivate meat from cells. Those are 2 of the sort of main things. If somebody is a policymaker, we would love to work with you to put this onto the agenda of whatever country where you operate. Somebody's at a nonprofit organization in any of the areas that we just talked about. Again, don't leave your organization. Elevate alternative proteins at your organization. And then GFI.org. We have a whole bunch of e-newsletters. So if I didn't identify you, you can figure out where you plug in by spend 3 to 6 months just reading the newsletters and thinking about where you might plug in. And then GFI is a nonprofit organization. The thing that brought us together, Eric, are recommendations from OpenPhil and Founders Pledge and many others. We do think you could not do better for marginal value with your philanthropic resources than GFI. So if anybody wants to chat about that, you can find us very quickly and easily at gfi.org, or you're also welcome to email me directly, and I'll send you to the right person.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and welcome back. I'm looking forward to chat with you in the future and hear about the progress that have happened, because now I'm a lot more curious about especially meat cultivating, like cultivated meat, than I was before. So thank you for being here and welcome back.